Welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month, CityWorks explores the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. 20 years ago, New York City transit workers walked off their jobs, shutting down the transit system for 3 days, a monumental event in the history of the city, and one that remains relevant to workers and all of us today. The strike was a rare instance of a major U.S. union defying anti-strike laws, specifically New York's Taylor Law, shutting down a city of millions for fair treatment. In today's escalating attacks on workers' rights and public sector unionism, the legacy of the 2005 transit strike bears powerful guidance for labor organizers today. On this episode of CityWorks, we're going to look back at the New York City transit strike of 2005, deemed both a win for workers and illegal by the courts. And we'll learn why some lawmakers in Albany are pushing legislation to modify the Taylor Law in order to give public sector workers their right to strike. Joining us for today's discussion is strike leader Roger Toussaint, who in 2005, as president of the Transport Workers Union Local 100 here in New York City, mobilized the nearly 40,000 transit workers to walk off their job. Roger Toussaint joins us from Georgia, where he lives, and with me here in the studio is Bill Herbert, Executive Director of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College, where he is also a distinguished lecturer in labor and employment issues. Thank you both for joining us. Roger, Bill, take us back to 2005. I had to think a little bit. What else was happening 20 years ago? And I remembered, well, there was Hurricane Katrina, for one. What else? What was some of the kind of historic context of that year? Bill, something stand out for you from 2005?
Well, Mayor Bloomberg was in City Hall, and Governor Pataki was in Albany.
Yeah, all right. So that's some of the political context. What about you, Roger? You remember anything in particular from 2005, that context, what was happening at that moment?
Yeah, we were 2 years into the war in Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan as well.
That's right.
Those were huge factors.
And the reauthorization of the Patriot Act was happening, I think,
right,
if I recall correctly. So here we come to December of 2005, a moment that you remember very well, Roger. Describe, if you will, what was preying on your mind, what was weighing on your mind as you entered that period of negotiations that, of course, preceded the strike, and then that big moment of deciding the strike was the way to go.
Well, I guess the main thing is just being very mindful of the profound arrogance and tone deafness of the MTA, not understanding the degree of anger and frustration that had built up among transit workers. Yeah. At the time, in 2005, the average number of disciplinary actions against members annually was in the thousands. It had been from around 2001 and on, it had been about 16,000 annually. Just the mistreatment. People were being written up for all sorts of arbitrary minor infractions. People were just extremely frustrated by the disrespect. But also, the MTA had reported a $1 billion surplus. And on the day before the strike, the MTA board met and disposed of the entire $1 billion without ascribing a single penny to our expired contract with the transit workers.
Anything you would add to that picture, Bill? What else was at stake at that moment?
Well, what was at stake was basically a question of power and the dynamics within the labor, in terms of labor relations. One of the things that Roger and other leaders did was they did a lot of internal organizing to be ready for the situation prior to the strike. And one of the things that is mindful of that strike was the level of leadership and mobilization necessary to empower the union and to proceed with the strike.
Coming back to you, Roger, what Bill's just said is so important. It wasn't like you hadn't planned for this. You were part of a caucus. You were part of a movement inside the union preparing for this very moment. So take us to that moment where you decide to go on strike, and how did you weigh what you knew were going to be some of the repercussions with what you thought could be some of the gains?
Well, Bill is correct. It would have been impossible to either have pulled it off and to survive the consequences, the penalties, unless a tremendous amount of mobilization had taken place before the actual strike. We had mobilized over 1,000 shop stewards, for instance, internally. We had, so our members went through very challenging, like preparation. We viewed every confrontation prior to the strike as a dress rehearsal for the major battles we knew were coming, knowing the MTA, knowing that they would always operate from a tone-deaf position and would overstep things.
So you also knew that there was in existence something called the Taylor Law, and the Taylor Acts were cited consistently as evidence that you didn't have a right to strike. How did you address that? People saying, it's illegal, it's illegal.
Well, neither myself or the majority of transit workers, at least at the time, were in our mindset was never strike avoidance. Our mindset was never to run scared of the Taylor Law. Our mindset was always that we were determined to do what needed to be done, and we had needed to figure out in advance at least how to deal with the consequences, penalties that come. So that was our approach, not strike avoidance. The MTA did not understand that. They thought that by using threats that we would back down. In fact, what ended up happening is that the more they resorted to threats and slanders and slurs, like calling us thuggish, the more transit workers got upset and determined to do something about it.
You had the workers being called rats, the New York Post, and thugs, you name it. Bill, coming to you, I mean, that is the big question regarding the Taylor Law. Do workers have a right to strike?
Well, the Taylor Law provides for penalties and prohibits strikes and provides for penalties. Of course, like civil disobedience, the fact the law prohibits something doesn't mean that people won't do it. So with regard to the Taylor Law, there is an example of a strike that happened just this year. One of the largest and most lengthy and largest, which is the correction officers who went on strike. 150,000 correction officers went on strike for 22 days. They did not feel like, with the TWU, did not feel that the Taylor Law prohibition stopped them from striking. Of course, it had an incredible adverse impact on those incarcerated and being put in solitary confinement, et cetera. But the same idea, though, of the Taylor Law does not mean that you can't strike. It's just a matter of the question of facing penalties.
Is it important to know where the Taylor Law came from?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of history, but one of the things to keep in mind is that prior to the Taylor Law, there was a prohibition against strikes. That prohibition was against the individual workers. The Taylor Law changed that to increase the penalty, impose penalties on the union, as well as to the individual worker. So that did not change, but it became more enforceable. The prior statute was viewed as being not successfully enforceable.
Because there had been people in favor of it.
Well, the Taylor Law was enacted after the 1966 strike by the TWU. That was precipitated Governor Rockefeller putting together a commission to study and ultimately prepare the Taylor Law, which expanded collective bargaining in New York and unionization to hundreds of thousands of workers, but also imposed penalties for striking.
So one of those quid pro quos, devil's bargains. Coming back to you, Roger, we're always told that anything having to do with mass transit is a losing proposition for unions because consumers, travelers, commuters, workers will get so angry and be so disadvantaged and inconvenienced by the strike. What happened in this case?
In this case, on the second day of the strike, polls were conducted, I believe, by the ABC and similar news organization. And it showed that a majority of the riders, of public, supported the union instead of supporting the MTA, despite the fact that people were being hugely inconvenienced. Our message had resonated among the public. We did not go on strike for increased wages. The public face of our strike was that we were refusing to accept an inferior pension for future generations of transit workers, who we call the unborn. So the fact that we were striking for future generations mattered in terms of the public perception of the strike. And it ended up being a very positive position for us.
Paint the picture of how people got around. I mean, the story is extraordinary of how, nonetheless, people did manage to get to work, lots of people, how we saw how it was possible, in fact, to get people through our city with less traffic than normal.
New Yorkers are, of course, resilient folks. And people took to walking over the bridges, carpooling, and finding a lot of innovative ways to manage. Of course, everybody was paying some toll, some price. Mayor Bloomberg suggested that people started doing more biking. And in fact, one of the posters in the strike was, "Mr. Mayor, here's your bike." So at the end of the day, I mean, you do what you have to do.
Yeah.
And I think that people always respect fighters and people that stand for something.
I'm just reminded that there was also international support for what you're doing because it was major news around the world. I looked up 2005, major historic events of this year, and you're one of 5 that's mentioned. I mean, Roger, at the end of the day, do you remember how that felt to be the face of that contentious, exciting campaign?
Just let me clarify. The media was very vicious. They were calling us thugs and rats and so forth. Mayor Bloomberg himself stepped into that at one point on the first day of the strike. He referred to transit work or union leaders as thuggish.
Right.
And that was, when you listen and you hear that with your inner ear as a New Yorker, people perceive that as having a racial undertone.
Yes.
Because even if we were striking for wages or striking for benefits, what is thuggish about that? Yeah. Why would you choose that particular word to describe our behavior? And there was a backlash over that.
Yeah.
And I think if anything, more people turned to be sympathetic after that whole that exchange about calling us thuggish, describing our strike as thuggish. But at the time, we did not strike to change the world or to get international fame. In some respects, we struck because the MTA did not believe that we would have struck. Right. The MTA did not believe that it was faced with a credible threat of a strike. For 8 previous rounds of bargaining since 1980, things had gone down to the wire and there was no strike. So that was not unreasonable on the MTA's part, quite frankly. And my guess is that even some of our members might have dismissed it as rhetoric. But when you look at the membership mobilizations that were taking place before, thousands of members. At one point, for instance, in the lead up to the strike, we had simultaneous job actions on 80 properties in one day. Wow. And that means that people would stage shop gates, stage protests outside the workplace, stage marches through the neighboring communities in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan. That's quite absurd. And thousands of members were involved in those activities. So if you took an objective view of what was going on the ground, you would have realized that members were in motion. And there was a fighting spirit, spirit of defiance. And you would have taken heed. But they did not do that. On the last day, the last hour of negotiations, literally, the MTA presented a demand for the creation of a new pension that would require newly hired transit workers to pay 6% towards their pension. tripling it from 2% contribution. And when that word reached our executive board, it was like there was blood in the water. There was no holding back after that. No matter what happened after that, we were going to strike.
When we come back, we're going to talk about what the relevance of that 2005 strike is for today and what our guests think is brewing at the level of worker and community fire in this moment. But we're going to take a short break. You're watching CityWorks. Welcome back to CityWorks. We're talking about the historic 2005 New York City transit strike and the lessons we in organized labor might take from it. Roger, I appreciate your reference to the word thug and its kind of gendered and racialized aspect, and thinking about how blonde and blue-eyed Sarah Nelson, militant as she is at the head of the Flight Attendants Union, would never be called thuggish. So I appreciate that point. We should also say quickly that you, Roger, paid a serious price for the strike that you helped to lead, as did the union, the TWU. So first off, let's just remind people, you were sent off to prison for a few days, right?
Yeah, the court sentence was for 10 days, and ended up being 3 days, and because there was a camp outside of the strike, and that became top of the hour news report. So every newscasting, they actually began to beg me to leave the tombs.
But they did.
And not so they found a way to pretend that the 10 days was really 3 days, and so we turned that around on them. But that was a small inconvenience to me. And of course, there were also personal fines against myself and the other two top leaders of the TWU at the time. But most importantly, and there was a fine on the union of $2.5 million, which we ended up having to repay over a year in 12 monthly payments from 2006 to 2007. Most importantly, having paid off the $2.5 million, the court then ordered that our dues be revoked permanently. So our dues were suspended, and we had to move from automatic dues collection to individual collection of dues, so from each and every member. So we had to transform the union in order to do that. I don't think there's any other union since before the Second World War that was had been accustomed to collecting dues by hand. We now had to do exactly that. We did it quite successfully. We did to take a hit, of course. We went from collecting about $1.8 million on a monthly basis down to about $1.2 million. And at the end of the day, about 60% of our members had paid up all their dues. Over 90% had paid up some of their dues. So, because you would always get slackers and so on.
Yeah. And that's that's requiring much more action by the employee, by the worker himself to sign up and pay that way. Coming to you, Bill, anything you would add to this picture, especially of repercussions and consequences to the strike?
Well, so part of the repercussions was the violation of the injunction that had been issued against the TWU, and that was with the penalties that Roger was talking about, the fines, et cetera. Under the Taylor Law, it dealt with questions of suspending dues deduction, which is one of the penalties that comes with it. But I think what's really important for viewers to know is that after the strike, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, examined the penalties that were imposed, and the Committee of Association made a ruling saying that the Taylor Law penalties are too strong and should be amended. This was in 2011. And since 2011, there really has not been any action taken to revisit the question of penalties under the Taylor Law, which many people view as being draconian.
Well, there are efforts to change the Taylor Law. There's a bill, I believe, being presented at the state level, and I think it is worth talking a little bit about what needs to change, what doesn't. As you described at the beginning, this year has seen a strike by public workers, corrections workers, with dire consequences for incarcerated people.
And their
We're
families.
celebrating a strike by transit workers that the majority of transit riders supported. So one law is trying to cover a lot. How would you like to see it changed, or do you think it shouldn't be messed with at this point, Bill?
I think that it is complicated enough that we should follow what history has shown, which is that there should be some kind of commission appointed by the governor and legislators to examine this, compare other statutes around the country, examine the ILO decision that Roger mentioned, and come up with a solution to the question of how the structure of the Taylor Law functions with regard to penalties for strikes. But if the legislature doesn't move on that, the mayor-elect could ask to create a commission to examine these issues. And besides occupational differences, you could also have geographic differences. So right now, the Taylor Law covers all of New York State. The legislature could grant the city the right to change its law, which is the New York City collective bargaining law, which is for city workers, and examine whether or not a right to strike for city workers should be done. And these kind of commissions have been done before. When collective bargaining came to New York under Mayor Wagner, this is in the 1950s, that was done after about 5 years of study and hearings conducted. Similarly, the Taylor Law had a Taylor Committee conducted hearings and studies before proposing the Taylor Law. So potentially you could have on the state level or even the city level a commission, a blue ribbon panel to make an examination of these issues.
So add it to the list on Mayor-elect Mamdani's desk, or raise it perhaps with Governor Hochul in an election year? What do you think, Roger?
Let me just make this point. Among the problems with the Taylor Law is that it places no similar burdens on the employer that it places on the employees and on the unions. There are no penalties against the employer for failing to bargain in good faith, failing to settle contracts in a timely manner. In fact, if anything, the Taylor Law encouraged them to just flaunt deadlines and to operate in even provocative manners. Yeah. The way the MTA operated in 2005 could come as close as you could to a provocation against its own workforce, with respect to including a new pension as a last and final offer, very onerous pension of tripling employee contract. That was a provocation, especially in the context of it reporting a $1 billion surplus. So there are issues of ways that you can address the Taylor Law that includes penalties against the employer, or in some jurisdictions, what has been done is that you have automatic wage increases to match the cost of living increases once you pass the deadline. But there needs to be some disincentive to bad behavior on the part of the employers and the municipalities, and none of that exists as things currently stand under the Taylor Law. Let me just make one point. We struck over protecting the future generations, who we call the unborn. Correction officers, part of their strike is over their ability to put people in solitary confinement indefinitely. So I just want to make that distinction here. I mean, strike, you can't just say it's a strike and therefore we're all in the same boat.
Fair enough. I'd love you both to address this moment where people feel, I think, a lot of fear around stepping out of line, around what might happen if they catch too much attention. What possibilities do they have for collective action in this moment? What's your message to people today? And I'll start with you, Roger, and then come to you, Bill, because I am hearing people, Sarah Nelson and others, talk about a general strike. Is it viable? But what's your message to people feeling a bit scared out there, Roger?
Well, I think it begins with your frame of mind, how you approach difficult situations. Keep in mind that change never occurs in times of peace and calm and where everything is hunky-dory. change only occurs in difficult times. And the point in time when change occurs is when the resistance begins to match or exceed the intensity of the attacks that people are faced with. So, it has been said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Um, so we are in a crisis, and there's no question in terms of the national political life and the international atmosphere it is also spawning. But I think that we need to look into that as opportunities. I think that it's very important to have that very clear mindset. Don't panic, organize.
What do you think, Bill? What would
Right?
you add to that?
I would say education, mobilization, internal organizing, particularly within unions, and being focused on issues that unite, not create division. And that's really important, to keep focused on issues that unite people, as opposed to do extraneous things which cause dissension. So, and one of the things that the TWU experience demonstrates is that with leadership and with mobilization and community support, there's amazing things can occur through collective action.
We could keep talking, but we have to end. I appreciate you so much, Roger Toussaint, Bill Herbert. Wonderful speaking with you both. That's it for CityWorks this time. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. And if you like what you just saw, consider making a donation to CUNY TV or the School of Labor and Urban Studies Foundation at the links on your screen. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.